My name is Amanda Lamond and I run Awakening Lawyers. To me, an awakening lawyer is a lawyer on a conscious or spiritual path who is helping the new legal system to emerge by being a justice warrior, an activist for social change, or a peacemaker. In order to understand awakening lawyers, you need to know that you are part of an entire movement of lawyers all around the world who are realizing that the current legal system is dysfunctional, it is toxic in many ways, and that it is time we birth a new system. It doesn't mean throwing out the old one, but we need to start developing alternatives that work better for both the lawyers who work, and by that I mean all legal professionals, so lawyers within the system, and for our clients, for the sake of humanity. In this video today, I'm going to talk to you about the Integrative Law Movement so that if you are an awakening lawyer, you realize you are not alone. Now, you may have noticed that we are in a state of sort of systems collapse at the moment, and as of 2020, that has only speeded up more and more. So we're seeing the demise of our economic system, the medical system, various businesses. We're realizing that the purely capitalist model is exploitative and doesn't work for everybody, and that it's come at huge cost to the planet. So we need to find new systems. The food system and what we're eating is so unhealthy in so many ways. There's a revolution going on there. The monetary system and the development of new alternatives and cryptocurrencies. We're seeing the demise of the existing monetary system as we know it. And then we're seeing that various governmental systems all over the world are starting to fail as people revolt, and new systems are needed for where humanity is at this time. So the legal system is no different. We have got to this point where we realize we've created a system that no longer works for where humanity is at this time in our development and existence. Everybody sees the Integrative Law Movement in a slightly different way. So I'm going to read to you a couple of definitions of the Integrative Law Movement from the wonderful book, which is the main guidebook to this movement, written by my friend and mentor, Kim Wright. The book is called Lawyers as Changemakers, and if today's video resonates with you in any way, I highly suggest that you buy this book. It's published by the American Bar Association. So, the first definition is by a wonderful lawyer who I had the privilege of spending a day with several years ago. Her name is Linda Alvarez, and she's based in San Francisco. Her definition of integrative law is this: integrative law is a new wave of legal practices that are being developed and implemented all over the globe to serve the same needs and purposes as the conventional legal system, but to do so in a way that is far more likely to generate productive outcomes, to heal broken relationships, and address not only the conflict, but also deal effectively with the conditions that gave rise to the conflict, and thus turning conflict into an opportunity to co-create a better world for all. Linda is best known for her work on conscious contracts and a book by the same name, also published by the American Bar Association. There will be a future video which explains conscious contracts to you, but you're welcome to look it up in the meantime. Then we look at another definition, this time by Glenn Mayer, who's in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he says, integrative law is a context for law. It's more of a lens than a practice area. It is like putting on 3D glasses. Your perception of the world changes. The integrative law glasses have to do with seeing the legal system as an interconnected system of human beings. The integrative law movement approaches are expressions of the interconnected view of the world that arise in many different contexts. And then finally, because I'm quite excited and proud to be featured in the book Lawyers as Changemakers, I'm quoting myself here, which is kind of weird. So there we have me. And what I have written about the definition of integrative law is this: an integrative approach to law involves a mind shift towards understanding that a legal system is a fluid and dynamic system. It's inextricably woven into the fabric of the society that it's expected to contain. We are at a moment in legal history that requires a fundamental reorganization towards problem solving and a new operating system to successfully address our global epidemic of chronic conflict. Old legal practices and court models produce fragmented and compartmentalized outcomes which do not resolve the core problems or produce positive societal or individual satisfaction. Lawyers and law firms need to start shifting consciously from a rigid, hierarchical, left-brain, win-lose mindset to a more intuitive, inclusive, interconnected worldview. And these shifts will not only change the perception of the legal profession in the public's eye, but will also allow lawyers to fulfill their clients' needs in a more authentic way. So all over the world, new legal practices and processes are arising in response to these issues. In Kim's book, she also explains, and in all the talks she's done for many years around the world, that we can use the parable or story of the blind men and the elephant to try and understand integrative law, because each person who comes across this movement or new ways of practicing tends to see it from their own perspective. Integrative law is evolving, it's dynamic, it's explorative, it's experimental, it is about perspective shifting, and in some cases it can be surprising. The story about the blind men and the elephant, in case you don't know it, involves these 6 blind men, and each of them come across the elephant and try and describe what it is they are perceiving. One describes it as a spear because he's touching the tusk, the other as a hose because he's touching the trunk, the other as a fan because he's only able to feel part of the ear. The other, who's based around the belly of the elephant, feels that it's a wall. Somebody at the leg says it's a pole. And then finally, the person who can only feel the tail says, I think that this thing is like a rope. So it is indeed all of these things, and it depends on this perspective that we bring to it. So if you're talking to a family lawyer, they will describe integrative law as one thing. A contract or commercial lawyer may describe integrative law as quite another. But in fact, it is an umbrella term for all of these developments. So if we just take a step back and look at a little bit of history of law, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail, but how were disputes resolved before the adversarial common law system? Well, obviously we had systems of combat, so dueling and hand-to-hand combat and jousting, and then we developed into a stage of there were community tribunals, and this is talking about globally, all over the world. We had chief-led courts. In some cases, there was vigilante justice, and we had decision-making by kings and elders. In a lot of these systems, we had there was a broad focus on interconnection and on community, and societal bonds were very important. So how do we maintain societal bonds? However, what happened during the 18th century in particular was this massive shift towards individualism. And so instead of always seeing things in terms of the community and the legal system as something which is there to maintain the cohesion within a community, what are the social rules to maintain this, we shifted towards this highly individualized view of law being there to protect individual rights. What we started seeing was this rampant individualism where it's one person's rights against another, and the individual is far more important than looking at their community needs, which is why in our current system, when there is a problem, people are isolated and taken to court instead of the community with all the stakeholders whose lives are affected by the conflict or whatever has gone wrong being brought together. We also have a very win-lose mindset, and it's highly adversarial. The way that things are set up, even divorce, for example, is always seen as an adversarial, one person against another, instead of what would make better sense, people are realizing, which is how do we do this in such a way that the entire community is brought back to a state of harmony. The marriage may be over, but how do we ensure that we're not creating factions by the way that we treat the separation of a couple? So what happened is we moved towards a system which is the dominant legal system today in response to all the problems, and that system is one, it's very formal, it's based on truth, it's strongly subjective, although we try and pretend it's objective. It's about judgments and order and predictability and safety. These are the things that we pride ourselves, consistency, that we pride ourselves on having in our legal system today. And also a system, we wanted to design one that was capable of the volume of cases being heard. So as you know, judges have masses of court cases that they need to hear on their roll, and they don't get to hear everybody. They kind of just move through them. I've spoken to a judge recently in Europe who developed terrible migraines, and she said part of it was the stress of being a new judge and being told that she could not read all the papers. She simply had to read the first few pages of each case and make a decision for better or for worse based on what she'd been able to read. And when she questioned why she wasn't able to, they said, well, look at your caseload. You will never be able to read all the papers. So we've created this crazy system where the matter is quite devoid of humanity. You don't always even see the people. You're told that you can't apply your mind. There is no time to look at the situation systemically or holistically. You simply need to read as many of the pages as you can and then make a decision. One of the things we can look at as a guide for how the integrative law movement could develop is looking at the medical system. So in the exact same way we're looking at developments in law, we see the same shift in medicine, but law is probably about 20 years behind. So initially, if you look back long ago, we had a system that was, based on leeches. Then when anything was wrong with the body in the Middle Ages, they thought it must be to do with the blood. That was their understanding. People sold each other things like snake oil. And then if we fast forward a few hundred years, we moved to this really scientific model of medicine only, the allopathic medicine, and it's all about pharmaceuticals and chemistry, and this idea that there's a person behind that with thoughts and feelings that may affect their own treatment, that was cut out altogether. So we moved from one system and then a rapid shift to kind of ignoring everything that had gone before. And what we're looking at now in the integrative medical movement, and they call it sometimes integrated medicine or functional medicine, is how do we combine the best of both worlds? This idea that there's a person behind it and that your diet is important and your living conditions and your stress are all going to play a huge role in disease prevention, not just fixing disease once the body's already unhealthy, but in moving towards a view that it's about the maintenance of health that's important. And bringing in, as we see today, chiropractors and massage and nutrition, and really looking at the mind-body connection very strongly and seeing it as a holistic whole. So bringing in the best of the old with the best of the new. It is not saying that diet is everything, as some people fear. Well, what about science? We can still do the surgery, but we need to support that with other practices. So the integrative law movement is learning from the medical movement of how do we not just say, let's return to community courts of the long ago past, but how do we bring the best of what we know now to bear and incorporate and integrate it with the best of the previous systems that were more client-centric and community-based. So the point about integrative law is it's not looking at an either-or situation. It's not black or white, but it's looking at synergy. How do we integrate personal responsibility and personal freedom in the way that we create laws and execute them? How do we look at personal empowerment? How do we move from this highly rampant individualism, the I, to we, without just creating conformity? How do we make sure we don't just outsource justice and it becomes a business in the same way that the medical system outsourced hospitals, and in many ways those are regarded now just as a business, in the same way we talk about the issues with prisons, which are run purely as a business. Deliberative democracy is something that you can look into, which is affecting how we want to run things in the integrative law movement, different models and ways of thinking about things, and interest-based mediation as opposed to purely rights-based mediation. So to turn to this fact that we have a system in breakdown, we can look at lawyers like Professor Susan Dykhoff, who's an academic. She's a lawyer in practice currently. She also has a degree in psychology and lectured for many years, and she wrote a book called Lawyer Know Thyself. And Professor Susan Dykhoff, writes about the tripartite crisis in the profession, and I tend to summarize that as saying lawyers are not liked, lawyers don't like each other, and lawyers don't like themselves. Now, obviously, that is a generalization, but what we are seeing through loads of studies that have been done all over the Western world is that there's a high percentage of distress among lawyers. So in all surveys around well-being, stress, suicide, depression, anxiety, lawyers score extremely, extremely highly. There are increasing issues with incivility, so lawyers being aggressive towards other lawyers. And that's not just from studies. I hear that a lot from the lawyers I coach. There's a low public opinion of lawyers, and if you're watching this, you are one, so I don't need to tell you about that. There's a decrease in accessibility. Lawyers are seen as unaffordable. There's an increased willingness of clients to avoid the legal system, so not coming forward even when they could and do need the help of the legal system. We're starting to see the emergence of alternatives, so online platforms and different forums in which people can resolve disputes. And then the fact that the system no longer represents societal values. So people feel that the law and the legal system is out of touch with their own needs and their lives. It's a system in breakdown. So what's happened is that we have, as we do within any movement, we have pioneers and trailblazers who are emerging and leading the way. So there's this new paradigm in the law with lawyers who are going, look, I've got nothing to lose. The system is so broken. I am unhappy. There has to be another way to do this. And pictured on the slide are Stuart Webb, who's considered and referred to as the grandfather of collaborative law, who created a model called collaborative practice and has taught thousands of lawyers all over the world. In particular, his model is applied to divorce as a model where lawyers bring in coaches and sometimes a financial planner because they realize that it's not the legal issues on which the clients are stuck, it's the emotional issues. And so bringing in a team of experts and resolving things but avoiding the court system has been found to be incredibly effective all over the world, and helping clients to see long-term what they have to gain by settling things amicably versus the short-term, the pain and the hurt, which makes people want to fight. But the lawyers in this case are a guide holding a vision for the couple of what could be possible, and what could be possible for the future of their family if they're able to move through this in a different way. The other lawyer who's pictured on this slide is who we lost sadly in the last year is Peggy Horer, who was instrumental in developing drug courts, where offenders who are in court because of their drug problem go into a separate court system where they are able to get the help that they need rather than being thrown into the mainstream system and being put in prison, incarcerated for whatever they've done wrong. And it's been very successful in the drug courts that are now cropping up all over the world. America has certainly been leading the way, but for example, where a mother has been forging checks because of a painkiller, a prescription pill, addiction, it is far more beneficial for all of us as a society to ensure that that mother gets the help she needs and is able to return to her family rather than simply incarcerating her and children being put in foster homes. That doesn't serve any of us when you look at the long-term effects of what happens in family situations like that. The effect on society, not just that family, but all of us end up bearing the cost. The Integrative Law Movement is about designing people-centric systems. So again, just to reiterate, it's an umbrella term and it encompasses perhaps even hundreds now of different developments within the law. The shocking thing is that you probably won't have heard of about 80% of these areas. And why? The main reason is because law schools haven't kept up. So the students that I talk to are simply not getting exposure to the extraordinary developments that are taking place in the law. And then I think one of the other reasons is because we bill by the hour, the profession tends to be so cutthroat and head down that people don't actually have time to explore other avenues and see are there better ways that they could be practicing. So let's just mention some of them. There's integrating spirituality, law and politics. There's contemplative lawyering. There is restorative mediation, therapeutic jurisprudence, there are specialist drug courts, there are mental health courts, there's proactive law, there is value-based contracts and conscious contracting, holistic litigation, transformative mediation. These are just some of the areas that you might want to look into that all fall within the umbrella term of the Integrative Law Movement. So what exactly is it that we are integrating here when we talk about integrative law? We are integrating old and new legal models. So we have the traditional systems of law that have been around since civilizations first began, various indigenous processes which tended towards being about peacemaking, inclusivity, how do we determine a process that will work for the entire community. And for example, in many indigenous cultures, the idea was, how do we bring, when there's a wrongdoer, how do we bring them back into the community and to be once again part of society, instead of ostracizing them, imprisoning them, and sending them away. So these older approaches tend to be about problem solving and healing conflict and how do we build relationships, which is what we lost in the 18th, 19th century, moving towards this highly kind of scientific, objective and individualized system of law. So examples of blending old and new: civility projects about the way that lawyers treat each other, collaborative law, restorative justice, the problem-solving courts, and then there are many forms of mediation which involve bringing old models and new ways of thinking and neuroscience together. What else are we integrating? Spirituality, mindfulness, and values. So we're integrating spirituality because determining the best methods for the 8 billion people on this planet to get along with each other in a way that doesn't destroy us or the planet, it is a spiritual endeavor. Some examples of these developments are mindfulness training, which is taking place in many law schools and through many bar associations. They now offer CLE, continuing legal education points for mindfulness training. Understanding that your role as a lawyer is often a sacred responsibility would fall under these integration aspects. Realizing that the integrity of legal professionals really matters. And then looking at the values of lawyers and helping them to develop a practice that's in alignment with their values. So there are a lot of developments going on. If you start Googling these subjects, you may be surprised at how much you find. Moving on to what else we're integrating: personal development work and EQ skills for lawyers. So obviously, traditionally, the only thing that matters was your IQ and cognitive ability above all else. Now we're looking at work-life balance. How do lawyers demonstrate empathy and compassion? There are tools being used by lawyers such as the Enneagram and MBTI, Myers-Briggs, and methods such as NVC, which stands for Nonviolent Communication, and extraordinary training that is aimed at how we take the violence out of our language, so putting things into non-inflammatory terms. And I can tell you that I've done some of this training with lawyers, and they found it so hard simply to take, as one person put it, taking the war out of words, trying to express things in ways that build relationships instead of put the parties against each other. And in fact, lawyers are trained to use the very opposite, to use inflammatory terms most of the time. Then there's PNDC, powerful non-defensive communication, another school of a training along the way we use words, and various other communication skills which are essential for lawyers. We're also integrating the left brain and right brain. So traditionally law was seen as it's logical and it's left brain, but now we're realizing that creativity is found in the right brain, and lawyers need to be creative to come up with solutions to problems which often aren't choosing between, a right or wrong, but is there a new and creative way that we could look at this so that everybody could win? Lawyers need to be creative in their work. Otherwise, we're just repeating the past patterns, and clients will then end up also attracting the same conflict in their lives over and over again, unless we're able to creatively help clients to see things in a new way and find new solutions and live differently. We are future thinkers in the Integrative Law Movement. So it's about an evolutionary and transformative way of looking at the law. Some of the developments in environmental law, we've got this whole newish field of earth jurisprudence. Now, I say newish because when we look at indigenous societies, they have been taking care of the earth forever. decisions were often made in Indigenous societies around how do we care for the earth, which is essentially, part of us. And that has been lost. So I'm hesitant to talk about, new developments such as giving rivers rights, which has been hailed as, groundbreaking, whatever, because actually Indigenous societies have been holding these views and practicing in this way for a very long time, and it needs to be acknowledged that these are not in fact new. We are borrowing from our elders and our ancestors. In medicine, to do with law, we're looking at fields of apology and how important it is, and neuroscience, how people make decisions, what happens to people's brains during conflict, that sort of thing. In education, there's restorative school discipline. Community, there's a whole new area of community and sharing law. You can look at a book by Janelle Orsi. In terms of psychology, positive psychology, I don't want to go through them all, but just to touch on the fact that there are lawyers working in all these novel ways. Systems thinking is vital for integrative lawyers, realizing that everything is connected. One person, one thing can make a difference, and that systems tend to change in predictable ways, whether it's consciously done or not. We always have to be aware when we're making changes that we're working within a system. There's been a lot of growth in integrative law models, so there are now 2,500 drug courts and 1,200 other specific problem-solving courts in 20 countries. In South Africa, we have sexual offences court, where we have specific magistrates who have been trained to have a greater sensitivity towards victims of sexual violence. In 2006, a survey of trainers estimated that 30,000 lawyers had been trained in collaborative law. So that's a long time ago now. I don't know how many people have been trained in collaborative law, but it certainly is growing. And I'm proud to say that I brought the first collaborative divorce trainers to South Africa so that lawyers here could be trained in collaborative divorce. There are over 5,000 current members of the International Academy of Collaborative Professionals in 20 countries. And the ABA has reported that books in the integrative law segment are among their most popular. So Lawyers as Peacemakers was an American Bar Association bestseller for 7 months in 2010. And of course now there is Lawyers as Changemakers too. Some of the solutions and responses. These are the books that you should be reading if you are interested in learning about different ways of doing things. The Happy Lawyer, Non-Adversarial Justice. There is the book called Preventative Law and Problem Solving by Thomas Barton. Lawyer Know Thyself, Practicing Law in the Sharing Economy. There's a huge amount of books, but you're going to need to seek them out because you're probably not going to find them in your law firm library or at your law school for that matter. Lawyers as Changemakers is the most central book. And just is the most inspiring because it has stories of hundreds of lawyers around the world who are practicing law differently and bringing about extraordinary change. Their personal stories also make clear this pattern of lawyers reaching a kind of plateau in their lives, very often a crisis of some sort, whether it's a loss of a divorce or grief or loss of a child or burnout or breakdown or cancer, where people have got to the stage of going, there has to be another way to approach the way I practice law or I'm out of the profession. And the stories in this book are the stories of lawyers who have found a way. And they are now holding the torch for the rest of us to find our way to healthier ways of practicing law, healthier both for us and for our clients. There are 4 pillars of integrative practice which are identified by Kim Wright after her enormous amount of research that went into writing these 2 books, Lawyers as Peacemakers and Lawyers as Changemakers. The first is mindfulness and reflective practices. So integrative lawyers all share this. They have some form of reflective practice which develops their self-awareness and awareness of other and client and what may be going on for the other. Then secondly is integrity, purpose and values. You'll find that integrative lawyers find these things very important and they have all done work to kind of establish what is their purpose, why are they here, what is most important to them, what their values are, and then how do they live in accordance with those values. You will find that integrative lawyers are systems thinkers. So regardless of which part of the system they may be working in, they're able to look at a situation holistically and think about it in terms of system thinking. And finally, integrative lawyers are harbingers of a new consciousness. So they think differently around the purpose of the legal system. And that's going back to jurisprudence. Why do we have a legal system? What is our role as lawyers? And that is starting to shift, where people are considering the many different roles that a lawyer can take. So while knowing that sometimes you need to be a gladiator and a warrior and fight for your client, there may be many other hats that you need to wear to be a successful lawyer. In another video, I go into detail about these 4 pillars of integrative practice and how you can incorporate them into your own life. Fighting against the system. I think that from my experience of coaching loads of lawyers over the last 10 years, one of the hardest things for integrative lawyers is when they find themselves fighting against the existing system and becoming exhausted and feeling like nothing is changing. So for that reason, you may want to consider, if you are looking at a shift in your career or you're starting out, where in the system you want to work or are best suited to working. Do you want to work in terms of bringing more light into the existing system, or are you a pioneer who needs to work outside of the existing system, pioneering a new way? So I have another video in which I talk about systems change and about whether people working outside or outside of the new system and entirely developing the emerging system, or those working inside the existing system. But for now, I'm just going to give one example. So Michelle Crosby is a US lawyer, and she created a startup which is called WeVoice, and it helps people to do their own divorce online and basically not spend all their money on divorce lawyers. So she says divorce is broken, or more specifically, the business of divorce is broken. It no longer works for anyone, not couples, not children, not attorneys, not judges, not court systems, nobody. As a result, its disruption is inevitable. For years, I tried to work completely within the system. I tried running a compassionate solo practice. I joined a collaborative law group. I became a mediator, and each effort was successful in its own way, but it wasn't until I got further out of the system by starting a company called WeVoice, dedicated to turning every divorce amicable, that I could see things clearly. Change in the divorce industry has been too focused on the business of divorce, and what we need is a movement. So this is an example of someone who tried everything to stay working within the existing system and eventually realized she couldn't and needed to create an alternative to that system. And that's a really good example of looking at where you want to position yourself. This is Pauline Tesler, who runs the Integrative Law Institute, or ILI, in California. She says who a lawyer is matters just as much as the power of the lawyer's intellect. And I was so inspired when I read some things by Pauline Tesler that I ended up going to San Francisco to meet her a couple of weeks later. There is this thing at law school which is really interesting, that you are kind of cut off from who you are and you are encouraged to think in this way. So, as one lawyer puts it, it's like working out, if you're a bodybuilder, only the left side of the brain. So that logical side, if you're only working the left side of the brain, your left leg, left arm, you go again and again and again, you're going to become really lopsided, because the only way to develop yourself in a healthy way is to, if you were a bodybuilder, is to do both sides equally. And in the legal profession, we're taught to completely ignore intuition, creativity, which means you have to risk getting things wrong, which lawyers hate. We're taught to cut off from our emotions. We're told that we need to make decisions based on the facts and never get personally involved. But all of the neuroscience is proving that this isn't actually possible, that people are not rational creatures. We rationalize afterwards what are emotional decisions. And I always tell my clients, my lawyers, that people never come to court or seek legal help because of the facts. They seek help because of how they feel about the facts. And therefore, we are always going to be dealing with emotions of some sort or another, your own and the client's. And the only way to do that is to learn skillfully how to manage your own and others' emotions. We can't pretend that they're not there. So we can try and make dispassionate decisions, and we can try not to be swayed by our emotions and learn how to control them when we are in public, absolutely. But we can't pretend that they are not there and ignore them, because they are very much on the table and driving what's happening in the room, including people's ability to make decisions. It's very clouded by emotion all the time. So at law school, you're taught to kind of divorce what you're learning, this theory and the practical, the scientific application of law to facts, as if there's no messy human dimension. And I'm here to say that you can't ignore the human dimension. Who you are and your whole life experience matters. In the mentorship program that we are currently running, it was fascinating to see the stories mentors shared when we did a pre-program sharing. The crises that were spoken about, so losing marriages, substance abuse, losing a child, people losing babies, miscarriages, the normal and unfortunately normal suffering of the human life. And what intrigues me is that the lawyers who now practice in this extraordinary way have not found this path despite what they've been through. They have found a new path because of what they've been through. This journey of going through something has been necessary for them to come out on the other end with empathy and compassion and the desire to do things differently, both for their own sake in terms of their well-being as lawyers who practice and suffer enormously from secondary trauma and the enormous stress that goes with helping other people with severe problems. So it's both for their own health and for the health of their clients. They wanted to do things differently and have found new ways. I want to just mention Untamed by Glennon Doyle, where she talks about her own life. This has got nothing to do with law, by the way, but she talks about the necessity of going through things and says, who I will become tomorrow is so unforeseeable and specific that I will need every bit of today's lessons to become her. And I love this because this is in line with the thought I was just expressing, that we don't become who we are in spite of what we've been through, but we become who we are because of what we've been through. However, at the same time, there needs to be a warning that we can get very stuck in our story. Like, this is who I am, this is what has happened to me. And particularly when there has been a lot of suffering, we can get embedded in that story and this way of seeing ourselves. And we need to remember that the essence of who you are is independent of everything you lived through. The essence of who you are is independent of everything you've lived through. So although these things make you who you are, actually your essence is independent of all that. You are not your story. You are free to invent yourself and reinvent yourself at any time. And one of the biggest issues lawyers have is feeling that they don't have the ability to practice in a different way. But can I do that? And to let go of that identity of being a litigator or even of being a lawyer, it becomes so ingrained that this is how lawyers are, this is how things are done, this is how contracts are drafted, this is how cases are run. And lawyers in the Integrative Law Movement are questioning all of that. So I just want to end with a quote by Kim Wright, again my lovely friend and mentor and author of these extraordinary books. She says, "What is your part of transforming the world? If litigation is what makes your soul sing, then do it where it will make the most difference. Fight the bad guys, whoever they are in your value system. If you prefer to make peace, then do that too. Do what is true to your heart, but do something that matters to you and the planet. It doesn't have to be huge. Change is urgent. It is time to wake up. This is why we were born. This is why you went to law school. The world needs saving, and you are the one." I hope that this has inspired you to think differently about your path and maybe to start Googling some of these developments in the Integrative Law Movement. It is emerging as we speak. New things are happening all the time. And the best advice I can give you is to start networking with change makers so that you too can be at the forefront of these extraordinary things that are taking place. and within it start to find what calls to you. It's always a personal thing, and what excites you and delights you is an indication that that's what you need to follow. That is where your purpose and your path lies.